Hi and welcome to Gender, and what we're going to be doing is looking at gendered power and violence. Now I got to make a special note here. The material in this chapter is especially sensitive and potentially polarizing of both men and women in a class. And in reviewing this chapter, it is extremely important to channel your viewing in as productive and as objective means as you can. Now, having said this, I respect that everyone has had different experiences regarding power and violence, and as such, I have minimized the emotionally charged graphics, and I understand that anyone who would prefer just to review your textbook rather than watch the video, I understand. However, I will do my best to be respectful and prevent this material as a means to shed light on a sensitive issue. Now, what's also kind of curious, and it's an important point to be able to make to differentiate what we're talking about here, is that isolated incidents of violence that may occur because of individual pathology. An individual has a proclivity, personal experience past that lends itself towards a particular form of violence. This isn't going to explain why violence is pervasive as a society or as a culture. When we consider the social construct of gendered violence, widespread violence against a particular group, as is often the case, women or minorities, it does reflect views and values. Now, I'm going to revisit this in the chapter, and it's an important distinction. It's not about individual pathology. It's not about an individual and looking at all these different individuals and why they may have done what they've done. It's looking at the social construct by which the views and the values by which can be depicted that it's okay or it's acceptable or it's condoned in a society to inflict and use power or express violence the way that we do. So we're going to start with the many faces of gendered violence. Now, as I mentioned in the introduction, individual pathology won't explain widespread violence against a particular group. But what you're going to notice in this particular first section is that it's very heavy in the sort of variety of categories, subheadings under gendered violence. So we're going to go through these. I will not express, you'll find more material in your textbook than what I'll share on this video. Now, gendered violence as a definition includes physical, verbal, emotional, sexual, and visual brutality that is inflicted disproportionately or exclusively on members of one sex. Now, it's going to be important to also point out within this definition that not all power and gendered violence is against women. There is certainly examples of women who express power and are violent toward men. And so I don't want it to be viewed as being only in one direction, but there is certainly a disproportionate, statistically supported. Now, in both cases, both men and women who may have been victims don't always report, or don't always report for many, many times before reporting. And so that's also important to be recognized. So let's start looking at some of the definitions or some of the categories under gendered violence. Now, one of the first ones that we'll begin with is what's called gender intimidation. And this exists when people, because of their sex, gender, or sexual orientation, are treated in ways that make them feel vulnerable or unsafe. Now, this is also called street harassment. So when we think in terms of this, the common form is sexualized remarks made in public spaces. Now, you might recognize this as an old stereotype, and it's not that it doesn't happen. What I mean is, when a woman walks past a construction site and she's whistled and catcalled, that would be an example of that. Now, that certainly happens in many other circumstances than that's their stereotypical one. The LGBTQ people, or people who do not conform to gender norms, are also subject to gender intimidation in the form of humiliating, disrespecting, or imposing violence. And so it's important that it's affecting a variety of people. Now, sexual harassment is unwelcome verbal or nonverbal behavior of sexual nature that links academic or professional standing or success to sexual favors that interfere with work or learning. And in this case, women tend to be the most predominant targets. Now, it's an important recognition, this sort of variation of, professional standing or academic, where there's this unbalanced, experience. So now let's look at the quid pro quo harassment. Now, this is the actual or threatened use of professional or academic rewards or punishment to gain sexual compliance with a subordinate or a student. Now, this form of harassment depends on power difference. The person seeking the sexual favor must have some sort of power over the other person. And this is an example where the boss might do that with someone who works under them and will sort of, you can have this success or this will happen to you negatively if you don't comply with my request. Another category is the hostile environment harassment, and this is the unwelcome conduct of a sexual nature that interferes with a person's ability to perform their job or gain an education. It's also conduct that creates a hostile, intimidating, or offensive working condition because of sexualized conduct. Now, this isn't something that necessarily occurs specifically to gain favor, but it's the environment in which it works is so charged with this sort of hostility that it makes it difficult to get a job done or to get one's education. And so it's an important recognition of the distinction between some of these categories. Now, this form of harassment is often between peers. A hostile environment grows out of patterns of behavior. A single action is unlikely to meet the legal standard. And so that's what makes this particularly important in terms of a definition. A single event in itself doesn't necessarily make up a hostile environment, but a pattern of these behaviors certainly can. Now, the one we're probably most often familiar with in regards to gendered violence is sexual assault. Sexual assault is any sexual activity that occurs without informed consent of at least one of the persons involved. Now, one type of sexual assault is one we're familiar with is rape. And for many years, marital rape was not recognized as a crime. And in Canada, it wasn't until 1982 that rape in a marital relationship became illegal. Now, when I mentioned earlier in the introduction around, individual pathology doesn't necessarily explain the large amount of a particular group being targeted. But this is an example of a social construct where it wasn't, 1982, many of you in the class were born then. That 1982, it was illegal. It became illegal for a husband to rape his wife. And so it would suggest a social construct, a belief, a value almost, that it was acceptable within the relationship of a married couple, that was a part of the relationship. All right, so that's an example. Now, trans people are particularly vulnerable to assault. 1 in 2 are sexually abused or assaulted in their lifetime. The definition of sexual assault includes the concept of informed consent. Now, this is very critical. Now, listen to the definition. Informed consent is only given by an adult who is typically who is of typical mental abilities and who is not under the influence of alcohol or drugs and who is not being coerced. Children cannot give informed consent, nor inmates who are coerced. And so when you think of informed consent, it's unfortunate that we have to be so specific, that the idea that you need to say yes and mean yes, that when you say no, it means no, that we have to be so specific is unfortunate, but it is a reality in the world in which we live in. And you might remember, those of you who are a little bit older, that in our universities in Canada, that was a big issue around this, what we'll call as a rape culture, and that you'll see in your textbook as well, that Queen's University and a few others we're almost, not the university itself, but the students were promoting non-consent for sexual activities, and so that took on a huge life of its own. And that was in the 2000s. That was 2010, I believe, or 2008. Sexual assault has been a major problem on college campuses. One of the reasons for the prevalence of is the existence of a rape culture, defined as common attitudes, beliefs, and practices that ignore or excuse, encourage, or even normalize sexual violence. And that's kind of what the image of putting signs up in the dormitories that students were putting out, facing out into the complex, where people could see that no means yes. That's we ignore that, we excuse it as being, just boys being boys, we encourage it, or we normalize the sexual violence as this is the way things are. Many people, including college students, believe in what are known as the rape myths, such as rape is usually perpetrated by someone who is who's a stranger to the victim. An estimated 90% of rape victims know their assailant. It's not a lot different than back when I was younger. In my 20s and 30s, I could remember the campaign of stranger danger for children being abducted or children being assaulted. And in fact, it wasn't strangers who were predominantly the perpetrators. It was people that the children knew. Claiming that a woman deserves to be raped is because of her behavior or because of how she dresses is what's known as blaming the victim, holding the harmed person responsible for the harm of another that has inflicted. I mean, this is still an issue, and this is why I mentioned earlier that it's not about individual pathology. It's about a culture, social construct where this becomes an excuse or excusable. If you read the news about what's happened not only in Canada but around the world, you'll see different examples where blaming the victim becomes a defense in court. Fewer studies have focused on the perpetrators of sexual assault and rape. A lot focus on the victims, if you will. One study found that 6% of men reported that they had raped or had attempted to rape someone they knew. Of those men, approximately 2/3 were serial offenders. So sexual assault is not confined to civilian context. It's a serious problem in the military. Now, this is a U.S. example where the Department of Defense surveys reveal that 90% of female cadets experience some form of sexism, including assault. In 2008, the United Nations designated rape as a weapon of war. Rape has, throughout history, been used as a means of ethnic cleansing, humiliation, and intimidation. Frequently, rape in these contexts goes entirely unpunished and is often inflicted on the very young. So when we think in terms of gendered violence, one of the ones that had for many, many years not drawn much attention and has only in relatively recent years drawn attention is what's known as intimate partner violence, which includes the physical, mental, emotional, verbal, and economic power used by one partner against the other partner in a romantic relationship. Now, look at that. I mean, physical, you'd understand. Mental, you probably do. Emotional, even verbal, yes. Economic as well. Intimate partner violence is experienced and perpetrated by both sexes and by all sexual orientations. There isn't an absolute, this is the only person who's only being perpetrated to. Men experience it, women experience it, LGBTQ people experience it as well. 25% of U.S. women have been violently attacked by husbands or boyfriends. Bisexual women are far more likely to be beaten, stalked, or sexually assaulted by an intimate partner. At least 30% of women worldwide have been victims of intimate partner violence. Now, what we'll also mention somewhere a little bit later is around the use of language and how it can minimize the effect. Even using the term intimate partner violence isn't the same as partner assault, where it's more abrupt and more clear and probably harsher. Intimate partner violence is a softer use of language. Control is the key issue for many abusers who want to control their partner's appearance, behavior, relationships, their lives. Violence between intimates typically follows a cyclical pattern: mounting tension, explosion in violence, remorse, apology, and honeymoon. Now you'll find this in a breakout box in your textbook. Both men and women can experience this sort of cycle. Now both men and women can be abusers, but there are general differences in the type of violence committed by men and the type of violence committed by women. Women tend to verbally abuse, slap, or shove partners. Men are more likely to use their bodies as weapons and commit assault. Abusive men's assaults are typically more severe. Men who engage in domestic violence tend to overestimate how common such behavior is, and or they underestimate the amount of harm they inflict. Men tend to use violence to enhance self-esteem with respect and exert control. And women are more likely than men to use relational aggression in romantic relationships, hurting partners by manipulating social relationships. Now, it doesn't make all intimate partner violence is damaging. It doesn't matter, that one does this or does that. It matters most that we've taken risks with a relationship that's based on trust. Stalking is another form of intimate partner violence. It is the repeated pursuit that is uninvited and unwanted that makes the target of the pursuit concerned for his or her own safety. This hadn't been a law for many years because police services didn't see that there was a victim. There wasn't a crime committed, and so stalking hadn't been a crime. That there needed to be contact between the stalker and the stalkee for there to be a crime. And so those laws started to come into effect back in the 80s and 90s as well. Now this next category is one which I'll just sort of mention. It's in your textbook, genital surgery. It's also called genital mutilation or genital cutting. This practice continues to be practiced in some countries where more than 200 million women and girls have been cut. Now the practice includes suna, a clitorectomy, infibulation, and male circumcision. And these happen in different countries and for various, usually cultural means. Genital surgery is rooted in cultural traditions, which can only change when members of the culture resist them, such as when Chinese citizens fought against the practice of foot binding. Now, another very important one and a very big issue, of course, is what's known as gender-based murder. Now, there's two facts that we should keep in mind when we begin to talk about gender-based murder. One is, when both sexes are given proper care, females will generally outnumber males. And the second is, however, in many countries today, men outnumber women. And so the reason for this is gender-based murder. Women being killed before or after after birth. Reproductive technologies can selectively abort female fetuses or select sex prior to in vitro fertilization. Others reduce the number of women through female infanticide, the active or passive killing of female children. Now, femicide is the killing of women and takes the form of adult women who simply disappear, dowry deaths, and bride burnings. It's amazing to think that in our world today that this can still exist. Femicide is not continued to develop in developing nations. Considering the statistics of intimate partner violence in the United States and Canada, or the mass killings of women, for example, in December 6, 1989, the Montreal Massacre, And this has spawned, that particular massacre spawned the White Ribbon Campaign. We can also consider the large number of missing Indigenous women in Canada that go missing and there's no consequence. We can also look, and lastly, at reproductive violence, which is the coerced or discriminatory infringement on reproduction rights. This can include force or exploitation that prohibits someone from having free will over the decision to become a parent or parent existing children. In the United States, this took the form of eugenics and state-funded programs that forcibly sterilized women involuntarily. Now, we also had examples of that in Canada. Now, the most notable one in most recent history was back in the 60s, where men and women who were institutionalized for mental disorders were forcibly sterilized so as not to reproduce. Now, racism has long affected reproductive regulations, with programs offering poor minority women free birth control but denied other healthcare services. Commercial surrogacy disproportionately affects poor women. In this practice, wealthy women who are unable to conceive or carry children pay poor women to carry children for them. The power dynamic is problematic here, with many women making the decision to become surrogates based on their own poverty and need for money. So now let's consider some of the cultural foundations of gender violence. Now, I'm going to go through this kind of quickly, but this is sort of the foundation by which some social constructs are supporting some of these gender violent categories. Individual pathologies alone cannot explain the pervasiveness of gender violence. So one of the places that we can turn to, and we've probably seen this for years, is the normalization of violence in the media. Now, gendered violence is frequent and varied in media, on films, in TV, in music, and in video games. Now, it's not to put all the onus on media, but media tends to represent and normalize things. And it doesn't mean that it says all this is okay because they're movies, they're stories. But a disproportionate number of stories have violence in them, from children's stories, Disney, to PG, let alone X-rated and R-rated. The music we listen to can be influenced and ingrained with violence in music. In the video games. Now, again, it doesn't mean that because one watches, or plays video games with violence, they are themselves going to become violent. But it does set the stage for fantasy, and fantasy, when repeated, can become something we'll act on when the conditions are right. Another area in which media is somewhat related to is terms of pornography, which is a sexual explicit material that favorably depicts subordination, degradation, and non-consensual sexual behavior. Now, not all pornography follows the same guidelines. However, the storylines and the way things get depicted is that this is what is to be normal, and this is to be expected, and this is what you should expect from your partners. Distinctly erotica depicts consensual activities desired by and pleasurable to all parties. But that's not necessarily true. I'm sure if anyone, watches a lot of pornography and expects that that's what people they're going to meet are going to want, may have come up with some different feedback. One study found men who viewed mainstream pornography were more likely to say that they would commit rape than men who did not. Now, there are certainly many studies that are being done looking at that relationship. One of the other areas is normalization of violence by institutions. Now, in the case of what we're talking about institutions, we're meaning the sociological perspective of what institutions are those major groups of people in a society that help society run. So family is an institution, schools are an institution, government is an institution. They're long-time endearing groups that influence society. If families have larger number of children, that influences schools, it influences hospitals, it influences government policy. So when we look at normalization of violence by institutions, we can look at a few of them, like schools. Now, as much as I've said in previous videos, this is a very US-based textbook. There are similar experiences that happen here in Canada. In the US, there are 55 colleges and universities subject to investigations because they have or may have mishandled investigations on sexual assault. And in Canada, we have our own mishandlings of investigations into sexual assault on campuses. Many students say that they are not taken seriously when reporting rape or other sexual assaults. Colleges and universities want to preserve their reputations is ultimately what ends up happening. However, part of the responsibility is to come up ways to protect students who attend those universities in order to and colleges in order to protect reputations. The White House established a special task force in 2014 which provides information and resources on preventing and responding to sexual assaults on campuses. 2014, not that long ago. This has happened here in Canada as well. Now in Georgian, for example, there's been more focus on student safety with postings for access to the security and apps for security purposes. So schools have an influence on this culture. Families is another institution. In families where violence exists, children grow up assuming violence is a part of marriage. Families may encourage women to stay with violent men for economic security because it's her duty or for the sake of the children. And those have been long-standing traditional expectations. You know, he'll be better. It's that cycle of abuse, you know. Well, it's your duty. You're married. You haven't had an education in post-secondary. You've been a mom. And if you leave, how are you going to make money? Or stay for the sake of the children. Immigrant women and women of color may be especially vulnerable to pressures not to report intimate partner violence. Even the institution of law enforcement has an element to take responsibility for. The current legal system does not offer sufficient safeguards for victims. Some law enforcement officials and judges give greater priority to maintaining the two-parent family than safety of the survivors. Laws governing restraining orders need to be strengthened so people can get protection before tragedy happens. Now, as I mentioned before, language as an institution is more of a cultural institution. What separates one culture from another is largely the language that they use and how they describe the world around them. Language sometimes reflects and sustains cultural acceptance of gender violence by obscuring the seriousness of the issue. So pervasive language that obscures moral responsibility for violence by not indicating the abuser fosters permissive attitudes towards abuse. Labels like domestic dispute, sex scandal tend to minimize the reality of what's really happened. And this is where I was mentioning about the softening of language around things that are gendered violence, so as not to sort of say we're all that bad. Now, resisting some of the things that we can do to resist gendered violence. So where do we go from here? Well, there's a variety of things that we can do. The personal efforts to reduce gendered violence, the most basic personal choice is to decide that you will not engage in or tolerate violence in your relationship. That's a message to both men and women. Refuse to be the silent bystander. Speak or act to prevent violence. You can join groups on campus or in your community. Write or call into the media. Teach your children that nobody has the right to touch them sexually or to have a violent act toward them, or that they themselves can't be the perpetrators. Teach them. Excuse me. Now, social efforts to reduce gender violence, well, these efforts can include supporting educational and social service institutions, voting for laws. The next time you vote, listen carefully for what the candidates are saying around the issues of gendered violence, and vote accordingly. That will reduce violence and punish those who commit the violence, and working with others to educate communities and create resources for victims of violence. Now, for example, and this is also related to the language component, the NFL, the National Football League, announced in 2014 it would take a more serious stand against violence in the league. But listen to what was said there. I mean, it's going to take a more serious stand. How? What will they do? What action will be taken is more important than making statements about what kind of things they're planning on doing. So as citizens, we can have a say by expressing ourselves, and this is where this third point, take a voice, comes to play. Direct power is the ability to make others do what they would not do on their own. So find your voice. Speak up. Agenda setting can be efforts to shape the public agenda, or to encourage or to engage in agenda setting in professional and social settings. Get involved. Join the walks and the demonstrations and the campaigns against violence towards women, or violence in intimate relationships. Voice is also communicating with others and engaging in everyday acts of principled resistance. One way to do this is to adopt the traitorous identity, as mentioned in Chapter 4, or to challenge sexist attitudes and practices in everyday life. If you see it, speak up. Now, I know this has not been the best nor easiest of topics for everybody, and I know it can be particularly polarizing, so I thank you for taking the time for viewing and listening. Review your textbook. Our test is coming up, so be prepared, and good luck, and thank you for taking the time. I've enjoyed this semester with you. I look forward to seeing some of you perhaps in another semester, maybe the winter semester, in an online class that I'll be teaching. So good luck, everybody, and enjoy your break when it comes up. Bye now.